Rádio Movimento. Ao ritmo da sua vida.
Nos 40 anos do livro, o programa do Desassossego. Agora na Rádio Movimento, com Ricardo Belo de Moraes.
Olá, viva, dou-vos as boas-vindas a mais uma emissão do programa do Desassossego. Sou o Ricardo Bel de Moraes e comigo está também a fazer Desassossego na regia e no apoio técnico o José Carlos Malveiro. O programa do Desassossego, recordo, surge pelos 40 anos que neste 2022 passam sobre a edição pela Ática em 1982 dos 2 volumes do livro do Desassossego de Bernardo Soares, com a organização de Jacinto do Prado Coelho, Maria Aliette Galhós e Teresa Sobral Cunha. A propósito desta efeméride, ao longo de 2022, por aqui desfilarão uma série de nomes da Academia e das Artes cujo trabalho está mais ou menos direta ou indiretamente ligado ao livro do Desassossego, do semi-heterónimo de Fernando Pessoa. Antes de ir até ao nosso tema da semana, digo-vos que a 13 de junho deste ano, dia de aniversário de Fernando Pessoa, a Casa Fernando Pessoa vai inaugurar uma nova exposição temporária sobre o livro do Desassossego e está a convidar toda a gente a participar nesta fase de preparação. O museu quer assim celebrar a data com os leitores e colocou por isso mesmo um formulário no seu site casafernandopessoa.pt, através do qual qualquer pessoa pode enviar à Casa Fernando Pessoa o seu fragmento favorito do livro do Desassossego. As sugestões estão a ser recolhidas até ao próximo dia 20 deste maio e vão ser tidas em conta na produção de uma instalação-jogo que vai ser o objeto central desta exposição dedicada ao livro do Desassossego na área de exposições temporárias da Casa Fernando Pessoa. Entretanto, e já sobre o nosso convidado desta semana, ele é o académico Thomas Cousineau, um professor emérito do Washington College nos Estados Unidos, onde lecionou literatura inglesa e comparada durante 3 décadas, com especialização nos modernistas. Mesmo depois da sua reforma em 2013, Thomas Cousineau continuou o seu trabalho de ensino universitário e de investigação em universidades de França, nomeadamente a Sorbonne, também na Polónia e na Roménia, além de manter o seu projeto online The Daedalus Complex. Na Roménia, de onde nos vem falar hoje através do Zoom, o professor Thomas Cousineau já ensinou nas universidades de Bucareste e Sibiau, e é nesta última que se prepara para editar o seu mais recente livro, The Seance of Reading, Uncanny Designs in Modernist Writing, pela Lucien Blaga University Press. O livro que nos traz hoje à conversa com o professor Thomas Cousineau é mais antigo, mas continua referencial. Ele, aqui está, é este An Unwritten Novel, Fernando Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet, lançado em 2013 e que então mereceu desde logo elogios variados da comunidade internacional, académica e literária. Não faltou nesses elogios e também numa colaboração posterior o Prémio Pessoa Richard Zenith. A nossa conversa com o autor deste livro e especialista não só nos modernistas, mas também como já deu para perceber em Fernando Pessoa, a nossa conversa com o professor vai, por motivos óbvios, ter de ser conduzida em inglês. E preparo-me então agora para chegar à conversa com o professor. Espero que, entretanto, ele já nos consiga ouvir. Good evening, Professor Cousineau. Are you listening?
Yes, and are you able to hear me?
Indeed.
Oh, wonderful, good. I've had. It's such a pleasure to listen to you speaking Portuguese. You know, it's a language I was surrounded by in my childhood growing up in New England, but I never learned it. And it's interesting, as you said, I did understand. You said that I'm in Romania right now, so I'm 2 hours later than you are. But listening to you speak Portuguese is pretty much like my experience of listening to the Romanians speak Romanian. Got the same level of comprehension, though I read Romanian better than I read Portuguese, I think.
And you are coincidentally, of course, in a country where Fernando Pessoa has been admitted in the academic circles and later on in the literary circles since a very early stage, since the 1960s, 1970s. Given how, for technical difficulties, we were forced to start a few minutes later, and not wanting to lose this opportunity of getting information out of you, if I can put it like this, I am curious, very curious indeed, to know if you do recall when and how you first came in contact with Fernando Pessoa, the writer, and naturally his body of work.
Well, it's quite interesting because with other writers, I can remember precisely where and when it happened. And with Pessoa, I was trying to think today of what bookstore was I in when I picked up, and it was actually Margaret Costa, is that her name? Her translation, right, of the Book of Disquiet, and I saw a blurb on it from the English writer Paul Bailey, who's a novelist, but also is a literary critic and a person whom I know. I invited him to Washington College many years ago and have a very high opinion of him, and he's also very funny. And the comment that he made, and I've always remembered it, is he said that no book has moved. I have not been so moved by a book in so many years. And he said, rarely, and this is the phrase that it's Paul Bailey. It's so perfect of him. I have rarely encountered such exhilarating lugubriousness. And I thought, first I had to check the word lugubrious to make sure I knew what it meant. And so it is that, he's very down in the dumps, very gloomy, very despairing, and so on. But just the joy that you experience in reading Pessoa. And, I've often said that since I wrote a doctoral dissertation on Samuel Beckett 50-some years ago,
Yes.
It was 1971. And since then, there have been three writers who I've been really moved by, and moved in particular then, as Paul Bailey says, by their exhilarating lugubriousness. And it's Emil Cioran and Thomas Bernhard, the Austrian writer,
Yes.
and Fernando Pessoa. That, and you ask me, and why is it that I worked very long years on writing this very thin book, and it was just the joy of reading Pessoa, and of reading and rereading. That book it's not even 200 pages, but it was years and years of work. But interestingly, there was not really much research involved because I don't speak Portuguese, to say the least. So I wasn't really, and there was not really all that much literary criticism, analysis, and so on in English. So most of the work was spent, but joyous work was spent reading and rereading again over a period of years. And I had a system of notation because, as you know, it's a very fragmentary work.
Indeed.
And I wanted to reduce it to some order in a way. So I had this little numbering system. I would put little numbers in the margin when I came, and then I'd go back through and I'd collect all the number ones. Or I don't remember what they referred to any longer, but the number ones and the number twos, and I would collect them and try to see a kind of system that was at work. And but that's it with Pessoa, as with Thomas Bernhard, and also with Emil Cioran, whose city I'm speaking to you from.
Indeed.
Today. He was born and raised in Rashenau, which is a suburb, just a little village outside of Sibiu, and he studied here in Sibiu, and it's a wonderful a wonderful coincidence. And also another coincidence I suddenly thought of today is I gave a talk in French on Pessoa and Charan in the small town of Talmachu, which is outside of Sibiu. I did it 2 or 3 years ago, and it was in a textile factory that I did it. So it was kind of an interesting coincidence with it.
Indeed.
And,
Well, considering how you got, let's say, smitten between
Yes,
commas
good
by the book of Disquiet, still when we begin to unravel your essay, so the unwritten novel, Fernando Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet. One, you said that you kept reading and making annotations, but one thing that almost immediately begins to become clear is that you also had the impulse to start reading other things throughout the years, to the extent that, in different chapters, you use to some extent the poetics of Álvaro de Campos to launch some of your thinking. And you also managed to build theoretical bridges, for example, between the three women that are the main characters of The Sailor or The Mariner. So it was not just a question of reading the Book of Disquiet. I presume that you felt the need, or at least the curiosity, to go on to other sections of Fernando Pessoa's work. And then you began to probably find communication vessels between them. How did you come up with this idea of using Álvaro de Campos, for example, to structure a chapter of your book, and the ladies of the theatre play The Mariner or The Sailor for another? This just for a start of the talk.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. And again, it probably has to do, I suppose, with the fact that I wasn't really reading very much at all literary criticism on the book. And I was reading around in Pessoa's poetry. I read David Jackson's book. I discovered that he had written a play called The Mariner. So I went and I read that and so on. And just in this very serendipitous way, with Álvaro de Campos, for example, it was, and I don't quite remember how it happened, where I read this poem in English. It's called Note, N-O-T-E, a 1929 poem that I saw was attributed at least at the time, to Álvaro de Campos. And you know the one I mean with is a
yes,
bar.
Apontamento. Yes,
okay, good.
my soul broke in 1,000 pieces, like a vase, and yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right, and the maid and the gods are looking
Indeed.
down, and the shards are on the carpet, and there's a line about the shards, or he has another word for them at some point, are reflected in the stars, or something like that. And I read, it's kind of the Humpty Dumpty story in a way, that I suppose it breaks into 1,000 pieces. But what I realized as I was reading it, and I suddenly saw this connection with the Book of Disquiet, that the broken vase was more beautiful and more stimulating than the vase in its finished, in its in its actual form. And that seemed to me a very good metaphor. It gave me, I quote that poem in the book.
Indeed.
Because it was really a launching pad in a way for the point of departure then, for my understanding of the way in which Suarez has this phrase. He talks about a greater completeness, and somehow the idea that all those shards on the carpet and so on, that they had more completeness than the completed vase. That was a very, very, very stimulating thought, a very productive thought for me.
I can relate to that, especially when I also think that you have become a specialist in the modernists, and several ones of them in particular, and the idea of the fragment is structural to the body of work of many of those modernists. And when we consider the Book of Disquiet, of course, it's an unfinished piece of work that Fernando Pessoa mowed and chewed on all his life, but he sort of like became a professionalist of the fragment.
Yeah, there are many things that I'm thinking of, and it rather late at night, but I'll try very, very hard to bring them all together. And this is a new phase of my thinking of Pessoa, but it was there from the beginning too. The idea that the work is very fragmentary, but it's very coherent at the same time. I was just rereading Roman Jakobson's essay, that very, very detailed analysis that he does of the Ulysses poem. Mm-hmm. And there are phrases that he uses, the architecture of the poem, the symmetry of the poem, and so on. And as you're reading the essay, you don't say to yourself, gee, what's he talking about? I don't see any symmetry. No, I mean, it's very, very obvious. Mm-hmm. The poem is very symmetrical. But I would make the same point at some point, whether here or in some other setting, that the Book of Disquiet is a very architectural poem and a very symmetrical poem as well. That it has a form, and a very, very coherent form, but it's rather an invisible form as opposed to the visible form that one finds in Mensagem. You say Mensagem, is that how it's pronounced?
Yes, Mensagem.
Right. Mensagem, right.
Well done.
That you find in that poem, for example.
Well, there is this other very curious idea that I found and anyone can find, of course, on the second chapter of this an unwritten novel, Fernando Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet, which is there is an association of sorts between Fernando Pessoa and Lisbon, much like, of course, Kafka in Prague, or Cavafy and Alexandria, or Eliot in London. In fact, almost everyone has been speaking for decades on how the Book of Disquiet would not exist if Pessoa did not consider Lisbon to be his home. And when he writes, Lisbon is my home, it's as if he's writing, Lisbon is my nest, the place where I feel safe, where I can be someone, where I can be myself. But even as it is, you tend to see Fernando Pessoa more like a flâneur, so a wanderer in his inner world, instead of exactly a flâneur going up and about the streets of Lisbon. Of course, Bernardo Soares roams through the downtown area of the city, but you, if I'm not mistaken, you also defend to some extent that he is more of a traveler inside his own mind and his own soul.
And that may be true in the unwritten novel, which of course was written a number of years ago. Was it 10 years ago or so? Whenever it came out, in the book, I did hear, even when you were speaking Portuguese, I did hear you refer to the seance of reading, which is
The new
coming out.
one, yeah.
Actually, it's coming out next week.
Oh, wonderful.
I just talked with the editors today. And as far as I find my own development of that question now, which I find really fascinating. I think I've recently seen a facet of that question, which I had not when I wrote the unwritten novel several years ago. And it's the relationship between the kind of flaneur that you're talking about, which is who's going about in the city and who's observing the various things that are there in the city, is you find that flaneur in the guidebook that Pessoa wrote, Lisbon, What Every Tourist Should See, where he goes around and here's is it the Belém, and I always forget the pronunciation of that beautiful monastery where
Mosteiro,
Vasco da
Jerônimos,
Gama,
yes, the Hieronymus Monastery, yeah.
What an amazing place that is. And he's so proud of the dimension that the Praça do Comércio and the magnificence of it and all of this. Well, and then when you look at the Book of Disquiet and you say, what corresponds to that? Now, what you said, and I think quite rightly, is that he's a flaneur of his inner world. And there are other readers who have made that point. But what I noticed in my recent return to the book for the seance of reading, which is now coming out, is the way in which he's a kind of flaneur of not these large urban spaces, but rather what I would call these dimensionless and invisible spaces. You look at the number of times he talks about going into the abyss, or going into the void, or going through the desert. They're just these, again, what I would say, not simply large and impressively large places, but really very astonishingly dimensionless places that have a kind of greater completeness, if you will, than the urban spaces. And that's so. And if I can make a pitch for my book very quickly,
yes.
I have paired chapters in the book, and it's the pairing between Pessoa and Chiron that I'm thinking of right now. So in the chapter on Pessoa,
let me just interrupt you to clarify that you are talking, of course, of the great Emil Cioran.
Emil Cioran, yes,
one of Romania's most famous writers and philosophers, if not the most famous. And you have indeed managed to, given how comparative literature is also one of your fields of expertise, you have, am I to understand that you have managed to pair them both to some extent?
And yes, and could I just, in a prefatory remark, say
yes,
that when you talk about my expertise, I feel like quite personally, maybe humbly, that I'm much more an enthusiast than I am. I fell in love with Pessoa, and I think, he's at the pinnacle now for me. I mean, I would forget about James Joyce and Beckett and Yeats, and not Yeats maybe. I would keep Yeats, but I really do think, and even with Pessoa and Chiron, I don't think that there's an equality of achievement. I think that Pessoa is quite clearly the greater writer, and one of the very, very greatest writers who ever lived. And with the new project that I have, which I shouldn't go into it too much, I'll lose my train of thought. The idea is I'm going to be talking about the Book of Disquiet as a modernist rewriting of Homer's The Iliad.
Okay, yes.
Is rather surprising, because you would think, oh, if it's going to be Homer, it's the Odyssey, right? Because the journey and all of that, which certainly is true, but in a much deeper way that I can't explain right now. I think the far more intriguing comparison is with Homer's Iliad. Having said that, I'll have to admit, and it's getting late here at Sibiu, I have somewhat lost my train of thought.
Not
Oh, I know,
not
no,
at, not at
it's
all.
come back. It's come back. We're talking about the pairing of Pessoa and Chiron.
Indeed.
And what I find fascinating is that, as with Pessoa, where I think that what I find fascinating is the way in which he say, quote unquote, as he writes the Book of Disquiet, he represses the Cicerone of Lisbon, of the guidebook, who is then reborn as Bernardo Soares, the bookkeeper. So what happens with Chiron is his greatest work, which he wrote in French, his masterpiece, which I compare with the Book of Disquiet. In French, it's called Précis de Décomposition, translated into English as a short history of decay.
Yes.
And what I find fascinating, and I know I've done a lot of work also on Chiron, he has an earlier work called in Romanian Schimbata la Fata a României, which has never been translated into English. I don't know if there's a Portuguese translation. In French, it has been translated into French. It's called La Transfiguration de la Roumanie.
Okay.
So in which he plays the role, he plays the role of the prophet that he announces, or he dreams of the future greatness of Romania.
Okay.
As Pessoa had
was considering the fifth empire of
Right,
the Portuguese
yes.
language and culture. Yes.
Yes, well, and also what I found really, really interesting, because I have the French edition of Lisbon, What the Tourist Should See. And I remember a few years ago reading it. I don't remember the man who wrote the introduction, but he said that one of the reasons that Pessoa wrote the book, it went back to his experience in, it was Durban, wasn't it, in Africa?
Indeed, yes.
Right, where he, and that he was maybe humiliated is too strong a term, but certainly distressed by the little regard, the scant regard that his British, for the most part, classmates had for Portugal, and their ignorance as to the greatness of the past of Portugal and so on, which I certainly knew very little about as well, and he wanted to redress, and that Pessoa was looking back as Chiron was looking forward. And what happens with Chiron, the title itself suggests it, Précis de Décomposition, is he went completely in the other direction. That as with Pessoa, he gave up that dream of the rebirth of Romania, and rather.
But abdicating, renouncing are also extremely precious values that Fernando Pessoa put in his own literature, especially in his poetry. So I can, not knowing where you're going in your upcoming book, I can see that even there it's possible to indeed find unexpected communication bridges and vessels between what they were writing. Yes.
Right. Oh, you mean? Oh, yes. Right.
The concepts. When we
right.
consider about the concepts, the major subjects that cross through both their body of work, the idea of abdication, of renouncing, for example, it seems to be very strong on both of them.
Right. Well, and also. Maybe to put it in these terms, renouncing the idea or the dream of the greatness of a particular country, whether it be Portugal or Romania, and turning rather to the creation of a monumental literary work in place of that.
You also dwelled on the mechanisms that you found inside Bernardo Soares as the narrator of the Book of Disquiet, when we realize the many fragments and passages where Bernardo Soares is apparently trying to educate himself to fight pain, or at least to be more resistant to pain, and sometimes even enjoying it.
Oh, that reminds me, I gave a talk on that subject. I don't know if you were there. It was a few years ago. The Casa Fernando Pessoa had a conference, an international conference,
Yes.
which took place in a theater. And I was the only one who spoke English. Everyone else, even the Americans, they all spoke Portuguese, but I was allowed to speak English. And there was a very lovely Portuguese woman who was there on the panel with me. And at the end, she said, "I didn't understand a word you said, but I really enjoyed listening to it." But in that, and I could have looked back at that talk, because it was the subject of dealing with pain. And I remember that, and my memory is somewhat faulty here, but Pessoa said that there were two ways of dealing with pain. One of them was to project that pain onto someone else, as he does in the case of Bernardo Soares, who can't write poetry.
Yes.
That's and has all of these various kinds of these neurotic symptoms and so on. He's so embarrassed when he speaks. Oh my God, what are people going to say when they hear my voice, and all of these real disabilities that he has. And then there's another method, and it has something to do with writing. And I simply don't remember
Yes,
now.
for the person to get himself or herself used to describing the pain to a certain point where you are actually almost feeling it, or possibly faking inside your own body those feelings of pain, even if you're not actually having them, which is also relatable to autopsychography, that famous poem where you can read, "The poet is a feigner, he feigns so completely that he even feigns the pain he has."
Right. I do remember. Well, what I found really interesting too, and I think I may have said something about this in the unwritten novel book, is there is this kind of manic depressive side to Soares, in that he's the aristocrat, he's the superior man, and so on, and those passages I don't find to be among the more interesting or the more memorable ones. It's the passages in which he's debasing himself, when he says, what is it? I'm waiting at a wayside inn for the truck that will take me off to the town dump, or something like that, to the abyss, off to the abyss. Or one of my favorite is, what does he say? I feel like I'm the stain that's left on the windowsill from a damp rag.
Yeah.
That is so.
Even regarding
He's so inspired by
the horse car, he says, well, if it comes to pick me up, fine. If it doesn't come, also fine.
Yeah.
Again, the sense of abdication. Well, I have a clock right in front of me, Professor, and given how we are still in need of, clearing, disinfecting the studios in between shows, and my next colleague will be on at 10 p.m. here in Lisbon. I only have time for one more question, and I would definitely want it and needed it to be about your definition and application of the Daedalus complex, which is even a project of yours online. But when we consider the mythical figure of Daedalus, people know of him, of course, and we'll assume our listeners all know of Daedalus for our purposes. When you think of the Daedalus complex applied to literature, and to what extent would you say it fuses itself with the very peculiar way in which Fernando Pessoa composed the Book of Disquiet? So what is your vision of the Daedalus complex applied to literature, and how do you think it gets fused with the way Fernando Pessoa came up with this Bernardo Soares semi-heteronym to create the Book of Disquiet?
Yeah. Okay. Listen. Really, really good question, and I'll try to kind of like with those speed chess players, where at the end you've got to pack in quite a lot. The idea of the Daedalus complex originated from my reading a comment by the American literary critic Kenneth Burke, in which he said that the motive of writers, say, along with the perfection of the work, is the perfecting of the victim. And I'd never thought of that before, the way in the idea of the protagonist of a literary work, Gatsby, for example, can be a victim, and that the author wants to inflict pain, wants to inflict death on him maybe, and that's very, very crucial to the perfecting of the work. I called it the Daedalus complex at first because I saw the legend of Daedalus, where you have Daedalus perfecting the wings, but then Icarus is the victim of the perfecting
of those wings.
Mm-hmm. Right. Daedalus perfects the labyrinth, and the Minotaur is necessarily, you have to have a victim, or you don't.
Indeed.
Oh, so what? He builds a labyrinth. Oh, so what? He makes these wings. Well, it's not a great story unless someone suffers as a result of it. I apply it in an unwritten novel in a way that I don't entirely agree with. And I remember at the conference in Lisbon, Richard Zenith told me that he didn't entirely agree with it. And now I agree with Richard Zenith in not agreeing. What I think now in applying this idea of perfecting the work and perfecting the victim is that, let me put it this way. What do I have, about 2 minutes?
3. 2
or 3 minutes. Okay. The last couple, I walk around with my Kindle all the time.
Yes.
Now, and Sibiu, if you've never been here, you have to. No. It's like Lisbon in a way, that wherever you are, you're just so happy to be there. It's so beautiful, and people are so nice. The hospitality, it reminds me over and over again of the hospitality that I used to have in Paris when I went to the library of the Fondation Carlos Gulbenkian. I mean, the Portuguese women, for the most part, who were there were just so lovely. But anyway, I've been reading the so-called complete edition of the book in English, which it's Margaret Coster, again, is that her name? A translation of, is it Geronimo Pizarro? Is that how his name is pronounced?
Indeed, yes. He was the...
I met in Lisbon a few years ago. And so he puts, as you know, all the early stuff that Richard Zenith puts in the appendix is right there at the very beginning. And what I found so interesting, I'd never noticed before, it's not the edition you want to recommend to someone who's a first-time reader. You want Zenith's edition because he starts with the really good stuff. So there's a lot of not so good stuff back in 19, but even there, though, there are some quite fascinating passages. But what I noticed is the frequency of the word touch. Don't touch. Women are don't touch them. If I touch you, you will drain my dream, or something like that. Many times, the act of touching is treated in a very, very negative way. He really retreats from it. And yet there's one passage later, I think it may even be early, I'm not sure, but where he uses the word touch metaphorically. The silence of my house touches infinity. It's one of the most beautiful passages in the entire book. And even when he's not explicitly using the word touch, are you ready? Here it is. It's the touching, what's extraordinary with Pessoa, Chiron, and Bernhard, it is their common feature. It's the touching of prose and poetry throughout the work. That there's a wonderful statement by Ashok Mandelstam, the Russian poet, where he says poetry rouses us into wakefulness. Oh, the difference between poetry and automatic writing, routine writing, is that poetry rouses us into wakefulness. And that's the experience that one has in reading the Book of Disquiet, that you're reading along and it's very prosaic writing. It's not prose poetry, it's prose.
Yes.
But there are these intrusions, there are these eruptions of poetry that they take your breath away. And the one literary work that competes, I mean, there are others too, I'm sure, but the one that's very much on my mind is Homer's Iliad, where there is a genius, the metaphor, a genius for poetic expression that Homer, whoever he was, or whether there was one Homer or many or whatever. Indeed. And of course, with Pessoa, there are many.
And Pessoa himself was the utmost complete reader of Homer, also, as we know. Well, probably a pretext now to pre-announce, who knows, a future talk between you and me regarding your new book, since you are going to have a chapter where Fernando Pessoa and Homer is the subject. I now have to go before my colleagues die of a nervous breakdown in the technical booth, given how we have these time contingencies. Thank you so much, Professor. It was amazing to finally be able to have the help of technology to have this chat with you, albeit so brief. But I'm sure we'll have other opportunities in the future. And for now, I wish you the best of stays in Romania and the best of work. And we'll all be looking forward to your new book, I'm sure. Professor Thomas Cosino, thank you so much.
May I conclude by speaking my one word of Portuguese? Obrigado.
Oh, de nada. Obrigado, nós. Thank you ourselves.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Professor. E assim ficamos a conversa com o professor universitário Thomas Cosino, o norte-americano académico que há muitos anos se apaixonou por Fernando Pessoa, por entre tantos outros nomes da geração mundial dos modernistas, e que se prepara agora para lançar um novo livro onde 2 capítulos vão ser dedicados a Fernando Pessoa em estudos comparatistas, depois do An Unwritten Novel que nos trouxe este programa do Desassossego. O programa do Desassossego que volta para a semana. Fiquem por aí, a Rita Baldaia vem já de seguida.
Nos 40 anos do livro, o programa do Desassossego. Agora na Rádio Movimento, com Ricardo Belo de Moraes.